This is Nathan LeClaire, independent coder and author, and you're listening to Coffee Moguls, the podcast interviewing internet entrepreneurs and icons who are tackling unconventional problems and getting unconventional results. On Coffee Moguls, we do deep dives so you can unpack what's behind their success, so you can get the edge you need in your career and in your business. Most of our guests and audience members love caffeine, so brew up a cup and settle in. Let's drink some coffee, let's pump some iron. Let's start a company. It's Coffee Moguls. It's Coffee Moguls. But first, the disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only and is not financial advice. The opinions are personal and not professional advice. Consult with a financial advisor before making any financial decisions. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome to the podcast Chris Biscardi, indie hacker in San Francisco, who is working on a variety of new Egghead videos teaching Rust and JavaScript skills. And he also has a YouTube channel where he consolidates news. So welcome to the show, Chris.
Hey, thanks for having me, Nathan.
Yeah, how's it going today?
Doing all right. I got my coffee. I'm here for Coffee Moguls, so hitting all the stride.
That's perfect. Like I was like rushing before the show, and I didn't even make a little coffee. So I'm kind of jealous right now, but I'm having a good time with the coffee today. I actually got this new water purifier.
Ooh. Yeah? How's that?
That's been taking my brews to the next level.
Would you advise that people get a water purifier for their coffee? Is that a thing that people should do? People who are into coffee, let's say, because
Yeah, I'd say I'm a big fan of the brews so far with it. The water in San Francisco is pretty good. It's pretty good, but I think it has a pretty high level of minerals. It would be my guess. I don't really know much about water, but I do notice that if it kind of evaporates out of a thing, I can see whatever's in there in the cup. And so, yeah, I definitely can tell the difference with the filter. So that zero water is pretty cool.
You know what made a huge difference for my coffee recently? I got a Stag EKG electric kettle, like a gooseneck kettle with a temperature control.
Oh yes, dude, that is clutch. Like people think I'm just
so
this huge
good.
nerd talking about the temperature.
It's so good. It's like it's not just the fact that the kettle exists and like it's a nice kettle and like control and whatever, but it's just like the experience of pouring my coffee out of a gooseneck just feels so much better. And like that's really what I'm about.
Exactly. And the temperature, I think that's a really underestimated part of doing a good brew, where my perfected technique, at least at this point, well, there's never any perfect brew, so full disclaimer, this is just like 99% perfect. But the AeroPress that I do it at this temperature of like 175 degrees, which is pretty controversial. I think usually you would do like 195, 200 for a pour over.
Yeah, I've been doing 200 myself. So
yeah, nice. Are you doing some pour overs?
Yeah.
Rad. But the guy who created the AeroPress, who also, by the way, I think basically invented the Frisbee. Like he invented
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he invented like a Frisbee. That was really
I'm like imagining like an AeroPress on top of a Frisbee, just like in a commercial, just flying by the screen now.
Yeah, well, he's just like one of these inventor guys. Like this is the people they're my people. They're like, oh, like I'm a freak for coffee, and I also like invented a Frisbee. That's how I made most of my money, is on Frisbees. But coffee, AeroPress is my real passion. Like who comes up with that? Like a plunge method to extract coffee. And anyway, he has like a video on the perfect brew in the AeroPress, and one of his tips is essentially like do it in 175. And by the way, if any other AeroPressers are out there listening, he also says that the invert method is trash.
Ooh, that sounds controversial.
Flipping the AeroPress. I need to whip up some controversy for this podcast. I need to get some views here. Well, but we'll get there one day at a time. It's easy to kind of get down on yourself when there's not too many listeners, but I do notice that slowly I'm getting more views.
Yeah. I think consistency wins when it comes to the content in general,
Exactly. And so that's something we should dig in on. And so, first of all, I kind of did a weak little plug, but why don't you just plug what you have to offer really quickly before we jump into the real meat of the podcast here?
Yeah, sounds great. So recently I've been focusing a lot on teaching people and figuring out how people learn Rust. So I've got a Rust course out now, and I've got a bunch more in development. I've got like between 5 and 10 courses just like getting ready to ship. And the one that's out right now, you can either take Rustlings. I've got a whole bunch of video sort of like explaining the Rustlings exercises and like what you could do and what you should do and like what's idiomatic and things like that. And then I've got like separate like project based courses. So like one of them is like building a digital garden CLI, and like it's kind of just like a small CLI. It gives you like a crate for argument parsing and like works with structs and things like that. Just like, Rust basics kind of stuff. But if you've never used Rust before, that's kind of what you need. And then on the other end, I'm expanding from, so I've been doing a lot on Twitter over the last like 10 years or whatever. And I've been expanding that into intentionally doing YouTube and intentionally doing TikTok. So we can talk about that if you want. But my YouTube stuff is more like newsy, like alpha, beta release software kind of stuff. Like keep your pulse on the trend of what's going on without having to stare at Twitter just like all day.
Yeah, I really like that because there's just so many things I feel like that happen that I didn't get caught up on, and so it contributes to that FOMO social media need to be constantly online. And yet I know that for my own mental health and for my own like just needing to go focus on my own projects, like I got to step back from the social media crack pipe, just put it down. And I love that idea of having some consolidated content there. And so actually, before we talk about other stuff, what is a digital garden? So what's this about in your new Rust tutorial?
Yeah, so Digital Garden is like people, you could call it a blog and that's fine, and like just ship your blogs and do whatever. But like I find that a lot of people, and myself in particular, at the end of 2018 I had this like 6,000 word blog post that I was working on, and I just like hadn't shipped it. It was just sitting there and it was growing, and it was like went from 4,000 to 5,000 to 6,000. It was just like no end in sight. And I just like it needed to get out. So the beginning of the next year, like, well, December like 31st or whatever, I just started like shipping stuff, and like I wrote something each day and I shipped it, and I did that for like the next 2 months or something like that straight. So I put out like 60 posts, whereas in like the past 6 months before that, I had put out like two, maybe. And that's kind of like the ethos of having a digital garden. Write something that was useful to you. Like if you had to look something up to solve a problem, then you have a blog post, right? You can write something because that pain, that problem that you just encountered, somebody else will encounter that at some point, right? So if you write the solution to that and you put it down, then it's also like you're writing, you're publishing, and you're helping people, which is like, what more can you really ask for?
Exactly. I mean, that was one thing that I found surprising when I started writing more frequently was that those get viewed. And sometimes the things that you think are the least likely to hit a chord or get a lot of traffic becomes one of your most popular pieces.
Yep. Yeah, I think that people's mental bar for like what a blog post needs to be has developed into this like, oh, it needs to be like a New York Times quality like editorial piece. And like it really does not, right? Like I was just saying, like if you have a problem and you looked it up and the solution to that problem is like 3 lines of code, and you write like 2 sentences about that 3 lines of code, and it like that's the value, like that solves the problem for the person looking at the post. You don't need to start with like the dictionary definition of serverless is at the beginning of your post. Like there's no need for that, right? So
Yeah, and that is always a constant struggle writing too, is like how much of this should I just outline from the beginning? But I do feel like a good approach is just to kind of go for it, say what you're going to say, and if they want to go figure other things out, that's what Google is for.
yeah, for sure. Like there's total place for like anything you want to write, right? I'm not saying don't write large editorial articles. I'm not saying like don't write these other things, but like in general, I think that people's bar for like I need to get this good to publish is way too high. And like you can write 2 sentences and 3 lines of code, and if that solves a pain for somebody, that's worth publishing.
Hell yeah. And I mean, like, one thing that I find is there's just like this huge, massive glut of super shallow content. just very 101 stuff. Oh, really cute. You showed me how to write like one program in Rust, like Hello World. Here's a million tutorials on like little things. But then when you like want to get into the nuances of like trade implementation or borrowing or something like that, like I'm really new at Rust, so I don't know exactly what to call on here, but those nuanced like deep dive or even just breadcrumb topics of advanced things that will help lead you to the right solution in the end are just criminally underserviced kind of part of content.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like a large part of the reason that is because people do the beginner level stuff, the 101 level stuff, and then they write about it when they do it, and they don't actually get much further sometimes, right? Like if it's something like Rust, maybe they pick up Rust, they do like a hello world, and then they don't do anything with it after that. And then you have the people who write, which are the people who are doing these 101s, and they're stopping using whatever thing that it was. And then the people who aren't writing are continuing developing more expertise in the language or whatever. And then they end up not writing. And then you have a culture of just like not writing stuff because the people who like are writing stuff just aren't in that space, or like they aren't continuing to do that or whatnot. So like, I think it's super important to like, especially if you haven't been, if you're one of these people who's like, oh man, I wish I wrote more, which is like a lot of people, right? Like, I wish I had a blog, et cetera, et cetera. Or like, I wish I published more. Like you don't have to turn it into a big thing. Just like every day you solve a problem. You're like, especially like a bunch of engineers, right? A bunch of software people. Like every day you have to solve some problem. That problem is a blog post, right? Like you take what you learned, you take what you solved, and you write it down. And it's exactly like documenting a PR. It's exactly like documenting your code. Like you just take literally the stuff that you would write as comments or as PR comments, and you just like transfer that into a blog post. And then it's on the internet and you've published.
100%, 100%. So if anyone out there is an expert, and I'm sure many of you are, write down some of your thoughts sometime, because the internet would really benefit a lot from it. I think I also find it's really useful that you can learn. It's like sort of a different thing than what we're talking about, where you just sort of jot a few things down. But if you do want to feel like you know a topic or a deep dive advanced item really thoroughly, I think like writing an article and sort of trying to educate other people on it is a really great way to consolidate that.
Yeah. So there's kind of two sides to this. And there's like the best people to teach are the people who are going to step into the place that you just picked your foot up from, right? Like there are people in front of you, there are people behind you, and we don't have to think about these like extremes, right? We don't have to think about because like I've been in the industry for over 10 years now. So like me writing for like somebody who just started picking up their first programming language, maybe I don't have the context for that anymore, right? I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm going to forget a lot of stuff. It takes a lot of effort. Writing for the person who's like going to pick up Rust this year, pretty easy for me, because like I only picked up Rust a couple of years ago, right? So write for the people who are like right around you or like right behind you, right? And then the other thing is like, if you write it and you write it for the explanation for those people, then you have to really understand it, because you have to think about how you're going to explain it to them, which helps you learn it better. So yeah, two sides to it.
Yeah, 100%. And we were kind of talking about this a little bit before the show, but why don't you share some of your thoughts on persistence, like whether it's with podcasting or other forms of content? Yeah.
So I think that really the way to win in like the content game or whatever is just to be consistent. Like just keep doing it. And like as long as you keep doing it, you're going to find success eventually, right? And one of the things that we were talking about beforehand is like a lot of people start podcasts, and you get a lot of like 5-episode podcasts or like 12-episode podcasts total. And if you stop at 5 or 12, you're not going to see the success that somebody that's been doing it for 200 episodes sees, right? Like, and there's the idea of like you start out and the podcast kind of sucks, right? Because you've never done podcasting before or whatever, or you've never like interviewed people before. Like there's skills that you have to learn, and the point is not that your first 5 or the first 10 or whatever it is suck. It's that the 150th one is going to be really good. right? Like your goal is to get to 100. It's to get to 200. And it's not to worry about like how bad they are in the middle. It's just to get a little better each time you do it. And the more you do it, the better you'll get. So if you if you're consistent and you just keep shipping them, then you will keep getting better. And eventually you'll be a person who's really, really good at being a podcaster, if that's what you want to do, or being a YouTuber or whatever it is, right? So that's why I think the consistency matters, right? Because a lot of people say they want to be like a blogger or a YouTuber or whatever. And they're like, man, I wish I had the time. It's like, so make the time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of those unfortunate truths about it. I think it's like that making the time aspect where you might be on vacation and yet you still have to like scramble and like get your laptop. Like your girlfriend is yelling at you and you're like, no, like I committed to doing this. Like I have to. So I always found that really challenging. But like anything else, I think that, again, that consistency really matters. If the people who are important to you in your life know that, oh, every Saturday you're editing for an hour or something so you can ship the podcast, that matters versus that inconsistency of suddenly, oh, like you're just randomly deciding on some Saturday that you have to do this and like set out, and then, you know, you only do it once a month.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that,
And
you know?
like defaults matter, right? And the way that people treat you by default matters. And like, aside from all of the people that you don't know and all of like the horrible stuff that happens on the internet and whatever, like they're the people who know you and you like and you have relationships with. It takes a long time for like whatever you're doing to like like what's the word for like water dripping through stuff? Like permeate. It takes a while for like stuff to permeate through that group of people, like the people you care about, so that they know that you're doing this thing, right? And if they know you're doing this thing and they know you're doing it at specific times, they will start doing things like asking you how it's going. And then you have like social accountability for getting it done, right? Like if I don't do it on Friday, people are on like Monday or whatever, when I get around to talking to them, are going to be like, so how's it going? Like how'd the Friday episode go? Because like maybe they don't care about the content, but they care about me and what I'm doing, right? So yeah, I mean, like the consistency goes towards that, right? Where you have to do it for a while so that your circles of people that you care about know what you're doing, and thus like, yeah, it takes a while to get it out, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny you mentioned that. I was listening to this video the other day on ADHD, and one of the things that can help ADHD people to be more effective and have better executive function is that accountability. Because if they know someone's going to be asking them, hey, did you do XYZ? That just happens to be a pattern that helps the ADHD brain like execute more effectively. And it's kind of funny. Like I do notice that like I've been having my own struggles lately of just keeping up that energy, trying to get more guests on the podcast, keep going in spite of the fact that there aren't that many listeners, knowing that if I give up, that's obviously it's never going to go anywhere. Right. If I just give up, but also that you just keep going. And I think one thing people don't realize is that effect of like having this back catalog. And I think this is really the power of content in general, where when you have this back catalog of like, let's say it's 100 episodes of a podcast, on episode 100, you're just naturally going to have more viewers than you had on episode 5. But also you're going to have this multiplicative effect where anyone who finds one of your episodes is going to maybe go listen to more episodes. They're going to go consume the old content. And that works for all forms of content. That's why I think content is the most scalable form of marketing that there is. I've always been a little bit of a skeptic on like conferences and stuff because it's just not as scalable. You know, you do the conference one time and maybe you get some leads and stuff, but then that's it. Right? There's no tail, there's no drip that ever, you know, kind of continues to pay dividends as you move through time. So anyway, that's a little bit of a rant about content.
Well, okay, so like I have a pretty strong like guess or hypothesis as to something that is going to work, and it relates to like conference talks and stuff. Like conference talks, I totally agree with you. Like I've given a bunch of conference talks, I've gone like internationally to speak and whatever, and like it's nice, right? Like I would do it again. I probably wouldn't do it as often as I used to, but especially in the days of quarantine and pandemics and whatever, and like a 10-minute YouTube video versus a 20, 30, 40-minute conference talk, right? If you are capable of writing a 40-minute like conference talk and a 20-minute conference talk, you can compress that into a 10-minute high-impact YouTube video, develop a little bit of production skill, and then ship that as often as you want to, and talk about what you want to in the increments that you want to talk about it. And then you have this huge back catalog of a public presence where people can subscribe to you. Whereas like you give a talk at a conference, you show up at the conference, a bunch of people who don't know you see you speak, and they're like, oh, that was a good talk. And then what do they don't do anything with that, right? Like nothing happens after that. Like there's the hallway track and whatever and things like that. And like there is a little bit of like, oh, I saw you give a talk here, and then I saw you like 5 more times, and now I know you, and now I follow you on Twitter or whatever. But like you're not building up credibility for yourself as much as you're building up credibility for the conference that you're speaking at, right? It's very similar to being an employee versus being a consultant, right? If you're an employee, you're building up credibility for the company that you're working for. And this is especially relevant in like DevRel and things like that, right? Where you get into the kind of like dynamic where you are kind of trading off your like public personal credibility for the company for use, right? And yeah, I think that there's a lot to think about there in terms of what you're doing and how it's going to benefit you over the long term. And like maybe in the days of everybody having an online conference, the difference between making a couple 10-minute YouTube videos and delivering a 20-minute conference talk at a couple of virtual conferences is the gap is not as big as it used to be, right?
Yeah, well, you certainly don't have any gatekeeping in terms of YouTube like you do with a conference where they're going to decide if you're going to present or not. And obviously that's one obstacle. But then, you know, it's funny that you bring this whole thing up because one of the things that I finally realized, and I'm so slow at this kind of stuff, I'm shocked that it took me so long, is that the real value of, I think, giving a talk at a conference for you, the individual. I mean, if you just like to help people out, make content, and like let other people mostly benefit, good, I guess. Probably don't do that actually because you'll burn out. But anyway, is that you really need to be like plugging your Twitter or something,
Yep.
or at least like your company, like you have a company and you're like, yeah, like sign up or whatever, but mostly your own personal Twitter, I feel like, or your own personal brand, is that you should start and then end the conference talk and probably even have on every slide your Twitter handle. And that has been, I know for me personally, I think that's where I've gained the most followers all at once, is when I sort of heavily promote like my own Twitter, like giving a conference. That's been the times that I've seen like 50 followers just follow me right away. I've never seen anything like that outside of that context. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that popped up in my head is like the obvious like counter to that is, well, I don't want to be a public presence. And like, cool, that's fine. Like, that's totally fine. Like, go do whatever you want to do or whatever, right? But the benefit to being a little bit more public about what you're doing is that it's extremely high leverage, right? If you think about things in terms of like risk profiles, being an employee is extremely risky, right? In the tech industry where things turn over all the time, especially if you're working in anywhere where like around startups or anything like that, your like lifeline, your paycheck is usually controlled by like one person, right? Like if your manager or like the person who happens to control your paycheck decides they don't like you one day or they don't need you or like whatever, it's a business and they'll just cut you and you'll be gone. And then like you start moving into things like freelancing or consulting and you start being like, okay, well, I can have a couple of clients at any given time. So like if one of them doesn't work out for whatever reason, I still have 3 more or something like that, right? The risk starts to spread. And what having sort of like audiences and communities that you participate in around Twitter, around YouTube and things like that do for you is that it expands that risk profile to be spread across so many more people. Right. So it raises your profile to the point where you can use that for higher leverage employment if that's what you want to do, or you can use it to go out and do your own thing. And that's kind of like where the negotiating power comes in, right? Like I could be going and doing my own thing. Why should I work for you? Right. And they'll go, because we pay you more. or like we pay you more consistently or something like that, right? You can get what you want because you have another option.
Exactly. I mean, I think that the real power of having a large Twitter following is something that, to me, at this point, I was really skeptical about, and I think that I've just been slapped in the face by reality there and realized it matters a lot. I mean, we were kind of talking about this in terms of like fashion, but I think one tendency of engineers is that they like to focus on like what they consider to be the non-superficial things, like, oh, I'll make the fastest website or whatever, and if I just have the best product, the fastest website, the most efficient code, like I'm bound to win. And it doesn't matter that someone has a large Twitter following or something like that, but it really does. It matters a lot. And so I do think people should be out there kind of promoting their own brand, and you just have to. You don't have a choice. You gotta get out there.
Yeah, you going back to like the website speed analogy, because like this is something that comes up in, I guess, the front end ecosystem like way too often. But like, if you have the absolute fastest website, first of all, if you take it to the extreme, like don't make a website and then it's fast, like super fast, right? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
So if you think about it, there's like some point in the middle at which it's like utility to people and how fast it is like are getting traded off, right? Like, do you want to build that extra feature and like that feature makes your site a little slower, or do you want to like cut that feature and focus on performance? And like you have to think about that trade-off, right? So I don't know. There's a point at which like you just have to do the thing and make the thing useful. And if the thing is useful enough, if what you're doing is useful enough, people like walk through like thickets just to get to the thing, because they're like, the thing that does for me solves a pain that is greater than me walking through these like thicket branches in shorts, right?
Yes.
And there's
Yes.
just like there's a trade-off there, and I think that that doesn't get discussed as much as it could, right? Where like provide value, and then at some point like do the optimizations and do whatever, but like provide value first and foremost.
Right. You have to be targeting the right thing, which I think it's really easy to get sidetracked. I mean, I know I've fallen victim to this countless times, just kind of wandering off in my own ideas and getting detached from the market. And it's normal. It happens to everyone, because you do have to do this grind of real product work, talking to users, maybe hearing things you don't want to hear, that they don't actually care about your ideas. They care about something else. And that's not fun. That's rejection. And it's not pleasant, but it is what gets results, right? So like, it's kind of like anything, like you got to put in those reps to get the results that you want. And then also they have to know about it. Right. So just coming back to this idea of like building out a Twitter presence or whatever it is, I mean, if you have 50,000 Twitter followers, it's going to be so much easier to get people interested in something that you're doing and at least get a few leads than if you have none. If you have no audience, you have no nothing, even if you have the most killer product in the world that solves a use case for people, you could go belly up. So, and I think it was really interesting, this point that you made, that being an employee, it seems like it's the safe bet. It's definitely, at least what my parents kind of put into me and told me, right, is like, get a good job, like that's the safe way. That's the right way.
I think all millennials have figured out that's not true, but
It's a lot more risky than it looks, right? Yeah. So like, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
employment risk. It really comes down to what I was saying earlier, right? Where like, if you are beholden to one person or one entity or one whatever, and that entity decides you're no longer useful, like companies are not families, right? And the ones that say they are like usually pretty toxic. So you're not going to like put extra hours in and get recognized and valued and appreciate. You're going to put extra hours in and they're going to go, great, we got 60 hours instead of 40 for the same paycheck.
Right. And your manager is going to get a promotion.
Right. Your manager's going to get a promotion because they sold the work that you did. Like, look how great of a manager I am. I got these people to do all this. It's such a racket. And like that, it's the idea of like, you have to be doing the work before you can get promoted into the position. Like, any time that I put myself into a situation where like my success depends on the opinions of other people and the whims of other people and like what side of the bed they woke up on that morning, that's a bad situation to be in, right? And like that gets back to like how risky is it? Like if your future, if your like promotion or your pay increase or whatever depends on like some misogynistic manager, like you're never going to get around that. Right? Whereas like if you have like a huge audience or you have a huge community that you're working with and like providing value to, some like that same misogynistic manager comes in, they look at your stuff, they go, hey, fuck you. And then you go, hey, fuck you, block. And then they're gone. And then you still have all the other people. Right.
Yeah. 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 And just leverage of any form is the only way to get it done. Right. And kind of, again, it's uncomfortable, but companies that didn't have any money for you for a promotion or a pay increase before suddenly will change their tune if you slap an offer in front of them.
Yeah. Okay.
You
Okay.
have
There's
leverage.
something else here, right? There's the amazing fact that if you're an employee and you do a specific task for a company, you're treated as a resource that is being told what to do and thus do not have leverage. But if you're a consultant that is doing the exact same thing, you're a highly valued asset that they came to solve a problem for them. And thus, when the consultant says something that is the exact same thing that the employee does, the consultant gets listened to and the employee does not. And that should speak some serious volumes to people in general.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of people have had that experience. It certainly is a really common meme that's out there that, oh my God, like they're paying these high priced consultants to just tell them what we already knew. And I think that's also an interesting thing to think about in terms of, as a consultant, that is how you want to frame things. You want to be framing it in terms of, hey, this is the value I'm going to provide. Oh, if I can make you 50K, then me charging you 30K is not a big deal, no matter how many hours I put in, because I made you 50 grand. So therefore you just made 20 grand for free. Right. And so any smart, savvy business, I think, is going to think about things that way. And so this is such great stuff. I'm really glad we're getting into this, but I want to slightly come back to something we were talking about a little bit before, which is just content creation. And I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of what you think are the trade-offs of each and where are the right boundaries for sort of monetization, right? Because I think we all know at some point we want to charge. And then it's just a question of what do you give away for free to get people interested and kind of help people out. Personally, I'm a believer in sort of the karmic, you do want to be putting things out there, not just because like, oh, it's going to have rewards for you, but because I still maintain this sort of fantasy that we all want to be sort of putting things out there into the collective conscious, and it's just this big mash of kind of primordial ideas that churns and churns and churns, and you will be just paying it forward on the big creative pile, right? So that probably sounds a little hippy dippy, and it is, but that's why I do think everyone has a bit of a duty to contribute creatively in the world. But at any rate, so there's lots of different ways you can make content. You can make podcasts. We're doing a podcast right now. You can make I think like blogging, so writing would be another one. You can also write
Newsletters would be more writing. Yeah, ebooks as well.
Yeah, I've written a couple books for O'Reilly, and I might do some on my own. We'll see. But you can also do videos, so YouTube. That's actually kind of a new thing for me. I'm looking at maybe doing more of that. What else?
TikTok is more video.
Oh, TikTok. Yeah. So like, I don't even think about that.
And then there's Instagram, which is like almost not video. It's almost slideshows.
It's like visual.
Yeah, it's very visual, but like a lot of like let's talk educational content because that's like kind of the area that you end up with like a bunch of slideshows, basically like square shaped slides that are easily visible on a phone, right?
I mean, honestly, I'm kind of surprised. Like, I'm probably just a boomer millennial, right? Like, a millennial who doesn't stay hip with the trends. But is Instagram, TikTok, those kind of avenues, are they working really well? Like, is that something that maybe, I should be exploring?
I would say explore TikTok if you're not on either of them. Out of the two, I don't really do Instagram that much. There are people who are very successful on Instagram. I'm just not. I don't think I'm one of the people that just wants to do Instagram, right? It's not my thing. Like I have a personal Instagram account, but it's like, hey friends, here's a photo. Not like any educational or professional. Like there's no value for people there. It's just my life.
Exactly. Same
But
here. My
like
Instagram Explore page is just a disaster. The algorithm's just
mine's
gotten
like
worse and
meat
worse.
and weights and like I went to the gym earlier. People, thanks.
That's really similar to me. Like I started liking like a couple tattoo pics, like follow a couple
Yep.
fitness influencers, and then like
Yep.
my Explore page is just, oh boy. I mean, like I'll let the audience at home use their imagination what it's like, but I'm just like, how do I unsubscribe? Like, how do I tell them like stop showing me so much of like this
How do
one
you
topic?
get off a boat that you
Well, they just like they hone in on these one or two things, and I'm like, okay, maybe show me a couple of pictures, but like
interesting note.
in there.
Interesting note. Instagram's algorithm tends to do that kind of thing where you just end up getting like completely blasted with that like one topic. And then you look at TikTok, and TikTok has this like interesting tier level and also like re-promotion kind of thing going on. So like I'm not a TikTok expert by any means. So like take everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But like my understanding is that there is sort of like levels. And like when you first post a TikTok, they kind of like expose it to roughly 300 people or so or something like that. Right. And if enough people like it or watch it or whatever, you get into like the next tier. And there are like, say, like 5 of those tiers or something. And then there's something else that TikTok does where they will like resurface your content to people at periodic intervals. So like that thing that you're doing on Twitter, if you create content and you have to like keep telling people about it all the time, TikTok kind of has built in, which is kind of interesting, right? Like I'll get a suite of views on some video that I did a while back and like I haven't touched in a long time, but it's still valuable, right? So like TikTok's algorithm is really interesting in that way. And it's very like me as a user, I'm going to go watch some stuff and my like For You page, which is kind of like your timeline or whatever, if you're more familiar with Twitter. Your For You page is like a bunch of recommendations, right? Like it's not necessarily the people I follow or the people I interact with. It's just like, we think you might like this based on the other stuff that you've liked. And that's, as far as I can tell, the way that most people consume TikTok. They just like scroll that page over and over and over. So yeah, I don't know. Like if you're going to do one of the two, I would do TikTok over Instagram, but that is definitely a personal bias, right? Like who knows? You may like Instagram more, but yeah.
Maybe. I mean, I don't, that's what I was wondering is, it's all about target audience. And so I just feel like for coders, Instagram, they maybe have one, but it's usually like more of a personal thing. And they're not really on there looking for like educational content, which at the end of the day, is mainly the goal here is to kind of like get people engaged through that. And so speaking of like monetization, what are your thoughts on the boundaries there? Like when do you kind of put up a paywall? What do you think about, how do you decide what to price and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I, in general, make people pay for curation, which means that I get to put out like all of these free blog posts and all of these free YouTube videos and all of these free TikTok content and like Twitter and et cetera. Like all of that is free. I like all of the code for all of my courses is like on GitHub and open source. So like if all you need is to go look at the code and be like, you can figure it out, then go look at the code and figure it out. Like you don't need the whole course with all the videos and everything like that, right? But the thing that I kind of like, the point at which it flips to paying for it is I have curated this like hour and 10 minutes of like extremely compressed video content, walking you through and explaining all of the things like why you're doing what you're doing and how to do it and things like that, right? So like a Rust expert would be able to go to like my, I'm doing a serverless Rust course, right? They'll be able to go to that and they'll look at it and they'll be like, oh yeah, obviously a couple macros. I wrote like this and wrote that, used some results or whatever. I know how to do that. And then they don't need to watch the course, right? So all of that kind of stuff is free if you want to do like self-serve kind of thing, right? But if you want to like be told all of the reasoning behind it and like organize like a sequence of 12 videos that are like well produced down to like 2 minutes each, right? I hate the thing where there's a course and they're like, this is 19 hours of content. I'm like, I don't have 19 hours. Like I just don't. Like, what am I going to do with all of that?
And also, like, where did you get that voice? Like, did you hire a voice actor to like these Hollywood guys like for your coding video?
Oh, yeah.
Nobody's got time. I don't have the money for that. Like I gotta do it like with my gear. Like,
Yeah, let's do like I don't. Which one? Oh, that was just my voice, by the way, for anybody listening. But
I might actually have to hire Chris for the voiceovers. He's got a voice like that.
But like, man, I used to sing and I can't sing anymore. And it's one of the most disappointing things. It feels bad, Like I sang in college in an a cappella group, and now I can't really sing anymore because I don't sing.
Well, I'll bring the guitar over sometime, man. We can sing. I sing. I took lessons for many years, and I think singing is really a rewarding hobby.
Yeah, I need to get back into it, build that habit up again.
Yeah, we'll sing sometime.
But yeah, like when it comes to like content, I don't want to ship something that's 19 hours that you have to pay for, and then also like you're paying for that twice, right? You're paying for it, and then you're paying for it again in time. And the time is probably more valuable than the money. Like that's the trade-off, right? Like if you pay me for stuff that I created that is supposed to be teaching you stuff, if I don't teach you as efficiently as I can, that's like worse for you, right? Like then I'm not doing a good job, right? So
yeah, well, and also maybe have it in kind of a nicer package, right? Where it's like you could go to the store, you could buy all the ingredients to go make a dish and then make it yourself, put in all the effort, kind of like go to all the different aisles and grab the stuff. Or you could go to a restaurant where they're going to wait on you. You're going to have a nice experience, good atmosphere. The chef's pre-prepared everything for you.
I'm going to tweak that analogy a little bit. I'm going to say that this is like the thing that I'm trying to do is affect some transfer skills from the content, right? So like, instead of going to a restaurant where all of it's hidden behind you and I'm just like, write this, write that, you put a semicolon here, you're done. Congratulations. It's more like a delivery service that gives you all of the ingredients and then also tells you like how to cook it. And like after you do that, you could go and buy the ingredients yourself. Like you don't have to buy them from me. You can go get whatever you want and then like add cinnamon into the recipe if you want to. And like the idea being that like I'm teaching you how to cook specific things so that you can combine them in the ways that you want to combine them, right? And that's kind of like the thing, right? That's what you're paying for. You're paying for like the curation of a set of things that will give you a set of skills that you can then use to build your own stuff. Because like a digital garden CLI is cool for me, but like that's not what you want to build with your life, right? That's not your problems are not a digital garden CLI. It's argument parsing and like figuring out how like which crates to use and how to use them and like how do imports work and what's the result and things like that, right? Like understanding the language and how to use it in a real context is the thing. It's not building the project itself.
Yeah. So it's like Hello Chris. You get your little ingredients delivered to your house, and just like you get like a little DVD, which for the younger people, it's kind of like. Never mind. We just Google it. But you pop a DVD in, and it's like Chef Chris. He's like walking you through how to do everything.
You know what I'm imagining right now? Well, you remember how VHSs used to have like the diagonal like noise through them?
Diagonal noise.
Yeah, like when you rewound a VHS tape or something like that.
It makes that annoying noise when you
and then like the screen is like that's what was in
my God,
head.
I forgot about that. Yeah. Like, so ugly sounding. Oh man. I remember when we were younger, we had like a VHS rewinder. It was like a little machine that would do it. And that was the coolest thing because you didn't have to.
This is why Blockbuster went out of business.
Nobody, I mean, like half the people that are listening to this probably won't even know what Blockbuster is, or maybe they will because like I might be an older demo.
There's one left. I think there's one that exists in the world.
Just right one. Now.
Yeah,
just like it's like historically preserved. just like no one can demolish it because like some weirdo decided it's like of historical significance. Like the last Blockbuster, just a tumbleweed goes by, no one ever goes there. It's pretty much cursed.
Basically, a museum. Nobody rents videos anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. So the one thing actually, like, we're kind of getting to the hour, but the one thing I was curious to like hear more about is just Rust. That's something that I've been experimenting with lately. And so tell me a little bit about how you got interested. What do you think are the unique advantages and kind of what you have been working on in Rust lately?
Yeah, sure. So like I've been thinking a lot lately about why people choose languages and why people use them. And the only thing that I came up with that is like a universal like thing that you can say that is like why somebody uses a language is either it fills a need that they have that only it can fill, right? Like I'm going to write some code on the web. I'm probably going to use JavaScript, right? Like there really aren't many other options and many other viable options, right? Like there's WASM and stuff these days, but like if you write for the web and you're building GUIs, you're going to use JavaScript at some point. So like the other thing, the other like sort of reason that people use a language is like, does it fit you, right? Like it's like buying gloves or like choosing to consume like specific movies. Like, do you like it? Like, does it fit how you want to think about things? Does it like touch your mind in a way that you like? That kind of thing, right? And like for me, Rust definitely does because specifically Rust for me is like JavaScript if TypeScript was built in from the start with a bunch of other like niceties that I don't really need to mention, but like it's more like writing a high level language that has low level language performance than it is any particular like, oh, it's memory safe and whatever. I'm like, yeah, okay, it's nice that it's memory safe, and it's nice that like if I compile, I don't have data races, and like it's nice that it's type safe and things like that. But you know what's nicer? Like it fits. Right? Like I enjoy using Rust. Like when I use Rust, the error messages that come back give me the code that I should probably write instead. Right? Like I know you've been working with Rust a little bit. You've probably experienced like the error messages that are like, oh, you know what you didn't do? You didn't import this trait and you're trying to use like try or try and do or something like that. And like the experience of like conversing with the compiler is really nice. And I end up with like very performant programs almost by default. Right. And yeah, when it comes down to it, like I enjoy writing Rust. And it turns out also that Rust is a good fit for a variety of problems. Serverless being one of the really good ones, CLI apps being another really good one. The things people term as systems programming, which kind of my hot take is like systems programming is kind of just like everything at this point. Like, yeah, I mean, like you're not going to use Rust to build your website, right? But there are good use cases. And if you have those use cases and you like the language, then you should use Rust. And if you don't like the language, then don't use it. Use Go, use something else. Like there's plenty of options, right?
Yeah,
And there's
well, I mean,
options
I
that
might,
are like,
like I might caveat that with a little bit of like give it a chance because I was a little hesitant to try it because like there was a lot of this kind of like template, you know, like the syntax around like borrowing and the ownership and that kind of stuff was a little like, oh my god, like there's apostrophes and arrows and stuff, like what the hell's going on here? But so far so good. Like I've been enjoying it and like adapted to like things fairly easily. You just learn to read things. Like it's like some of the things like that I see in Rust, I'm just like, all right, that's probably not what I would do. Syntax wise, but then you learn to read it.
yeah.
Like one example is like they love these like double colons, so there's like colon like new or whatever. Like that's how you like create a new thing. Yeah, like or like do a typecast. That like just looked weird to me, but then now it's starting to look a lot more normal. Like
Double
colon, and then it immediately has like a type inside of the little
angle brackets. You're talking about yeah. Okay, you're talking about a turbofish.
Wait, what is it?
Look up turbofish right now. It's like turbofish.sh or something like that.
Turbofish.
I think it's .sh. It's not .sh. I don't remember what it is. But there's a site that it's turbo.fish. .fish is an extension? Or like a TLD? Dang. Okay. It's turbo.fish.
Oh, I've never seen this. This is hilarious.
And like strictly speaking, you don't need to use it. Like you could put the type on the variable that you're declaring or whatever. There are a few situations in which you need to use this syntax. One of them is the .collect method, which is probably where you first saw it. Because
what the hell is the collect?
Collect is like an extreme example of a very generic function that can transform from one collection into another, right? So if I have an iterator in Rust, something that I'm looping over that has items, right? And I want to turn that into either a string, and I have like a iterator over cars, right? Characters. You can do collect turbofish with a string inside of those little angle brackets, and what you get back into the variable is a string. You can also put inside of the angle brackets like vec of cars, and then you'll get back a vec of cars. And like the way that this works under the hood is using generics, and it's like one of the most powerful generic functions in the Rust standard library, which is why people end up using turbofish here, because like it's so generic, you just need to tell Rust what you want. And then it can go under the hood and figure out like how to do that. But you do need to tell it like which thing you want, because it can be multiple things.
Yeah, I see. And so this is really one of the things I enjoy about Rust is that they clearly started with this kind of core of stuff that's really performant. You know, I can just tell like, oh yeah, like I know enough about compilers and stuff that that's going to be really fast. But then they have this sugar on top that not only is like makes things just look better and just like the code feels kind of cleaner and like nicer to write, but also that I feel like it's usually not too hard to mentally expand for me into what's really going on. And so that's always been a problem that I've had with things that get too magic is you kind of go, oh boy, like what is this doing? What is kind of the things that are really going on here? Is this going to have a huge performance impact? Like I do think that's one of the reasons why it feels like writing code in Rust just tends to be naturally really fast because the language is fast, but also they don't have too much like, you know, I mean, in Python, for instance, I've been working a lot with Python too, and one of the things that I've always run into is that there's these like debates that rage about performance in Python where people are like, oh, you know, like doing data stuff is not that slow because like you use NumPy or something, or like doing C or Fortran behind the scenes. So it's fast because it's C, or it's fast because it's like Fortran. And I guess what I've been discovering is like, that's like kind of a really optimistic interpretation. So yes, when you actually get down to the numerical code, like the linear algebra library or whatever it is, it's fast. But then all the FFI, all the stuff around it, like pandas, for instance, it's like if you're using pandas, you're bottlenecking your code probably so hard because that is pandas is about, you know, it's a nice user interface. It's not really fast. I'm sure you can write fast pandas code, but then you have to kind of become like a pandas expert. So one of the reasons I've been into Rust is like I'm kind of moving some of these things that I was doing in Python into Rust. And it's so much faster. So much faster.
That's one of the like that's one of the reasons that I really like Rust too. Like it feels like a high level language. It feels like a JavaScript or a Python or a Ruby or something like that. But what you get out of it is actually this like machine code, right? Because it goes through LLVM and then generates machine code for like any of these targets or whatever. And like the idea of Rust focusing extremely hard on like zero cost abstractions. And what that means is like if you have an abstraction and you're using a higher level construct, that you're not paying for that in space or time or whatever, right? So when you use it, it's like writing the lower level code. It's like fiddling bits or whatever, but it's not actually you fiddling bits. It's you writing like .iter or whatever, right? And I think that especially in like the JavaScript ecosystem, right? We kind of build abstractions that are costly. And then we build more abstractions on top that are also costly. And then we end up in this situation where you're building something on top of like a bunch of abstractions on top of Webpack, on top of one of these meta frameworks. And you're like many layers above. You're like V8, Webpack, Next, whatever. You're all the way up here. And then you have no way to get back down, right? Because all of these abstractions incur some cost. And then you just have to pay that or rewrite everything from the ground up. Like there's a company that's literally rewriting everything from the ground up by themselves. And even they're looking into using Rust for that instead of TypeScript. So
Yeah, well, like V8 is really fast, which is good because it's kind of like this is what we have, so we might as well make it good. And surprisingly fast to me. Like I hadn't looked at the benchmarks in a while, but it's really impressive. But still, I've been consistently frustrated, like a Babel build or whatever, rebuilding all of the stuff. It just takes what for me is really a long time. But I'm a speed junkie in terms of coding stuff, where like I love making things fast and it drives me absolutely bonkers when they're slow. So I notice, a 300 milliseconds build that feels slow to me.
Yeah, it's definitely like there are direct parallels too, right? Like the work on V8 and everything is incredible, and that's been going on for so long that we have like fast JavaScript in the browser now, which is amazing. It's like an incredible accomplishment. But also like when you look at like Babel, which is built on top of like a bunch of different things, and like now you're using it, and like you look at an implementation of Babel in something like Rust. There's one called SWC that like Dino and some other people use and stuff like that, and the difference in speed is pretty dramatic. And like, I don't necessarily think that that's Babel, the project's problem, because like just the way that Babel has to integrate with the entire rest of the ecosystem results in this emergent, like high time to do things. But like, if you take that and you use SWC and SWC does it in like milliseconds, or like I wrote a parser for MDX in Rust and that operates in like nanoseconds. Like I was measuring in nanoseconds while I was building it, which is incredible. Like you're telling me I can do what 1,000 pages in like a millisecond? Like that's a completely different realm than like, I don't know, a Gatsby build or whatever, where like you're waiting for 10, 15 minutes for whatever.
Totally. And those kind of speed ups, they really open up this new class of stuff just all on their own, just because Docker was like that, right? Where you used to have to boot up a VM. Now you just like run a container and you can run it like so much faster. Like that's really opens the doors for all kinds of new innovation. That's what I'm kind of hoping to get at with some of this Rust stuff that I've been doing, that, maybe some of these folks that were previously using Python and just thinking, oh, we either have to never do this all from scratch or like only do this like little bit at a time. We do it piecemeal just to keep everybody happy, make it fast. Maybe it opens the doors to more creativity and stuff. So
Have you looked into like Apache Arrow or Ballista or whatever?
briefly, like I know what Arrow is, right?
Okay. I don't
So
know much about it, which is why I was asking. You were talking about like manipulating data and whatnot, and like there's some piece of Apache Arrow and Ballista that are like written in Rust and like got contributed to the project, and like
oh
I'm gonna
nice.
look into that and see what that's all about. But like I'm not really a data person, so like was curious if you had opinions.
Yeah, not super strong ones. I'm sure, for some use cases, like storing your data in that format makes a ton of sense. Really, just like you almost always, for performance reasons, would want to store something as like a binary format anyway. And every serialization format like has trade-offs. But I'm really excited about the potential of that kind of stuff, especially as Rust just gets more and more popular because, yeah, again, with a Java program, some of these like data things are written in Java that just naturally has a bottleneck thanks to like the garbage collection, I think is the kind of the main thing. And while Java is super fast, and speaking of VMs that have been optimized to hell, you can tune. That might not help you when you suddenly pause the system to garbage collect for 12 seconds when you really want an answer back in a second, or something like that. And so, yeah, for instance, like at Honeycomb, the Go data store really would have been probably better off written in something like Rust. Now that wasn't really available at the time, so they did the right thing, I think. But yeah, the garbage collection.
One of the really interesting things about like Go is that Go and Rust came around at approximately the same time, but like we worked at Docker together at one point, and like Go was chosen for all of that, and it somehow felt like Rust wasn't an option at that time. But I feel like if it was built today, it would be built on Rust, right? Like you see Firecracker and stuff like that built in Rust these days, and like it just seems like a better choice to me.
Well,
But
certainly, there's a couple of things there. One is that definitely like libcontainer right? So the inner pieces where you're doing much more systems, like system calls and stuff, makes a lot more sense to have it that way. Like, if you look at the core of libcontainer, there's basically like hacks and C code that the maintainers are not happy about, but they can't change. And you get into all sorts of messy stuff because Go has this M by N scheduler, and like you can't really get around that. But yeah, I mean, I think at the time Rust was just changing things too much. And so for the sake of Go being so dogmatic about like we never ever ever change, that really made a big difference because then you can move super fast on the project. But one of the things I was thinking about when you were mentioning just kind of this pile of abstractions earlier was how exactly that has happened in infrastructure, where now just to run a process, you're basically like you've got your Docker daemon running. You probably have like two other daemons running, maybe one's for monitoring, one's for like Kubernetes, like orchestration. The Docker daemon has like all sorts of layers and stuff. Although I guess now people are just kind of moving on to containerd, which is probably architecturally the right call. But tons of people are probably still using Docker for that. And so, I mean, you're talking about like 2 or 3 or maybe 4 gigabytes of RAM that are just reserved for like just like the code that runs your code. That's pretty expensive. Like,
yeah. It's super interesting to see the evolution of the container ecosystem into like Kubernetes is really the thing, and then you look at like what service providers are doing with Kubernetes, and they're like, well, we'll kind of like handle that for you because like you don't want to run this. So you end up with like Google Cloud Run. And I can't remember what AWS's new thing is called, but they're like, run your container here, basically, right?
oh
Like
yeah,
pack
like
it up as a
Fargate.
container and ship it. Yeah. Well, not even Fargate. Like Fargate is like one step, right? It's managed Kubernetes or whatever.
No, Fargate is really the run a container anywhere. Like,
Right. So like,
they have EKS for the
yep.
Kubernetes. Yeah.
Yep. One of the problems with AWS is that it has 13 different ways or something like that to run containers. But there's a different one is more what I was saying, and a newer one that is even less like Fargate and more like just ship this container and run it, if that makes sense. There's so much overlap in the AWS component ecosystem.
Well, that is what happens when you need to meet metrics for your performance review. AWS is also see, this is one of the advantages of having a relatively small audience. I can talk a little, but AWS is also really good about solving customer issues. They're really customer centric. I definitely hand it to them in that way. And I do think that sometimes that does naturally tend to create some overlap because you're really meeting your customers more. You come 75% of the way to them, they come 25% of the way to you, versus I think some shops are just so opinionated that they kind of say it's our way or the highway. And I mean, programmers especially are so finicky about what they want. I want this level of abstraction and power, or I want this lower level or this higher level, that I do think that's part of why you get Fargate and EKS. And obviously like, ECS, I think was sort of the first thing. So yeah, that's not too surprising.
Yeah.
It is chaos though.
Oh yeah. Oh my. That's why people's entire jobs are like, what do I pick from the AWS ecosystem? And you're like, okay, so we've got a long checklist to get through, and how much money are you wanting to spend
like
here?
catalog consultant. Like that's all you do is just help them pick things out from a catalog.
Are you sure you want this?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, like, if the client wants it, they get it, but they might not need it. But one of the things that like all this kind of complexity talk has me thinking is that there's got to be an inevitable, and maybe it's already started, kind of snap back of the rubber band towards simplicity. And so you kind of mentioned serverless. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Are we snapping back eventually to the other side of things, where people will get sick of these like massive layers of Kubernetes and everything, which I feel like is quite entrenched at this point?
I think people were sick of Kubernetes the day it shipped. Like, just fun. Like people were sick of containers the day they heard about containers, right? Like there was kind of like two sides. You were either like super into containers and thought they were going to be really cool, or you were like, nope. And then like a bunch of the people that went nope also became experts in working with that stuff because they kind of had to as it all grew up. But like, I don't know. There's a way in which, like, I don't know. I lost my train of thought. Where are we going with this?
Well, I was just wondering, Kubernetes is so entrenched now, and do we think that this like massive increase in complexity that people have bitten off
Oh,
will result
snapback.
in
Yes.
a snapback towards simpler things?
Right. So, like, I don't know that there's necessarily going to be a snapback. There's an article I read recently about how Heroku was this, like, basically serverless, like, you ship stuff to it and it runs it, and there's dynos and whatever, so it's not technically serverless, but like Heroku was a great experience. And then it kind of, like, when you scaled up, you ended up having to pay like a ton of money. And then people ended up moving, like, off of Heroku onto AWS or whatever. And, like, they were the context of the article was basically like, why did the AWS component model win? Because that's what everybody is doing now, instead of the, like, a Heroku model, which they leveraged as, like, being like the next generation. Heroku is still the way to compete with AWS if you're going to compete with AWS, which I don't disagree with. But, like, I don't think there's going to be a snapback, right? Like, there might be a new project that everybody starts using or whatever, but, like, I don't see that right now.
Oh, come on, man! I want to get rid of Kubernetes.
Well, the first step in getting rid of Kubernetes is to never run Kubernetes.
There we go.
If you don't use Kubernetes in the first place, you never have to get rid of it.
On my new projects, so far, no Kubernetes. So far, so good.
I think that serverless is it changes the DevOps that you need to do, right? Instead of managing pods and processes and, like, how things run and access to the cluster and things like that, you start managing, like, where do I send my logs for this, like, short-lived function, and, like, how do I manage cold starts and which languages are we using, and, like stuff that's a little bit more relevant to your application, right? But I don't think that we'll ever get a snapback from, like, people on Kubernetes to people doing serverless, right? I think that those are two different use cases, right? The people who run Kubernetes themselves are always going to run whatever the version of Kubernetes, like the variant of Kubernetes, whatever that is in the future, they will still run that, because, like, it does solve needs at some point, right? But, like, the people who are coming from front end land who don't run servers, or the people who are looking for simplicity in their operational structure as opposed to, like, full control, are going to be increasingly moving towards serverless, right? And you can see this even in, like, Netlify does functions now. And, like, they do 4 different kinds of functions or something like that, right? There's, like, the regular Lambdas. There's, like, the long-lived background Lambdas, which, if you look at AWS Lambda, are actually the same thing. And then there's edge compute Lambdas. And then, like, on-demand builders is another one. So there's, like, the next stage of serverless is kind of this divvying up of Lambda as a compute resource into different products. And those products will be targeted at different use cases. And I think that as that grows, and as we get access to more and more databases, like, for example, PlanetScale, right? Like, we have Dynamo, and Dynamo's been around for a while, but, like, learning how to use Dynamo and architect your data for Dynamo is a very specific skill set. Whereas SQL is a more generic skill set because a lot more people know it. And, like, yes, you can shoot yourself in the foot, but it's also something that everybody knows from MySQL and Postgres and whatever. So, like, I don't necessarily see a snapback, but I do see, like, a next generation of serverless being like, what are your use cases and what do you actually need to care about to run your code?
Yeah, so basically just more of that, well, less of the Kubernetes is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, or containers is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and just having more options. So I think especially for, like, data and just kind of anything that's embarrassingly parallel, like, serverless will do really well, because it even just the mental model fits really well for that. And I'm kind of curious, you mentioned earlier, like, Rust is this particularly good fit for serverless, and, like, tell me a little bit more about that. Like, why did you mention that in particular?
So I write a lot of my serverless functions in Rust these days. And what I've noticed is that the cold starts are lower, and the run times are more consistent, like the memory usage and things like that. So, like, if I'm paying per millisecond, right, which is what you pay for Lambda these days, like, it used to be every 100 milliseconds bucketed. Now it's per millisecond. So, like, the difference between running JavaScript, which is going to break that 100 millisecond barrier a lot of the time, and running Rust, which is going to run in, like, microseconds or something like that, like whatever it's going to run in, right? 25 milliseconds even, like consistently with like 25 meg of memory usage every time you run it, or like 100 or whatever, like whatever the numbers are for you. Rust is going to do that better and more consistently and more predictably than it is going to be with like JavaScript. And that's for a variety of reasons. But like what I've found is that when I want to build serverless functions and I want to know what they're going to do and not have to come back and like tweak them later, Rust is the way to go.
Yeah, it makes sense because like if you think about a Ruby program or something like that, it could be just pulling in all these libraries and stuff, and like just importing those libraries sometimes takes a couple seconds. I've noticed that with Python, for instance. And so just being able to immediately jump into gear because it's compiled and you just exec it is something that I can see as a big advantage there, especially with this kind of wacky life cycle model that Lambdas have, where they have cold start and all that stuff. I still don't know that much. So I think that's about all. We're kind of getting to time here. And so once again, if people want to find you, what would you like to plug?
Yeah, if you want to find me on Twitter. That's my main source on the internet, main place on the internet. If you want to learn Rust, I've got courses on egghead.io that will teach you Rust. If you have questions, come into the Party Corgi Discord and ask me, and I will answer you, which is really nice. And then, yeah, if you want to like keep up to date without having to glue your eyes to Twitter 24/7, check out the YouTube channel and the Release Radar series. And yeah, hope to see you on the internet.